Call the meeting of County Council to order. Please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Good evening, everybody. Mrs. Lowell, you have a prayer for us tonight?
I do. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let us pray. We have come to this place to govern. We are encouraged and challenged to do our finest job. We need to remember why we are here and with grace do our best. God, help us to listen and hear what the people have to say. Help us to remember and help us to see and look ahead to what our duties will be. Guide us to listen carefully. We ask this in the name of our Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.
Mr. Smith, roll call, please.
Mr. Anderson,
Here.
Mrs. Fatika,
Here.
Mr. Horton,
Here.
Mr. Leone,
Here.
Mrs. Law,
Here.
Mr. Rastatter,
Here.
Dr. Faust.
Here. Hearing the public, all those that called in ahead of time will have 5 minutes. Anybody thereafter will have 3 to address council. First is Jason Brundell. When you approach the microphone, please just give your name and your municipality for the record, and you'll have 5 minutes.
But first of all, I need to pass these out so you guys
You
can.
can give them to our clerk.
Okay. One goes to each county council elected leader, and one goes to the solicitor, and I think I have an extra copy for the Kathy Delcamper, which is our county executive. Thank you, Erie County Council, for allowing me in my community to be heard. But first, I would like to say congratulations to the newly elected leaders, and I hope we can
Jason,
work-
could you give us your municipality before you go any
Thank
further?
Erie, Pennsylvania, the
Thank
city of Erie, sorry. Congratulations to the new elected leaders, and I hope you truly work inclusively to be transparent, with passion, to excel Erie County together. I'm not just here as a former candidate who wanted to break the ceiling for the LGBT community in Erie, but an LGBT citizen willing to serve in any capacity. I know I have sent you guys a packet last year, and I sent you guys a packet to talk about what I just handed you right now. There are 500,000 LGBT citizens in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. The State Equality Index just got released last week, and City Council is aware of this, and I did address them last week at the meeting. The Erie is low. We are the lowest in the Commonwealth in the region, and this is heart-wrenching, because guess what? Mike Mulliner of Erie Gay News in Northwest Pride Alliance organized the Erie County Human Relations Commission in the 90s. Thank you. Thank you, Mike, for standing it up 30 years ago. But that commission has lied to my face because of what I just handed to you. Please stop lying to the public, to me and my community, because for the past 20 years, it's been a lie. I can only file a complaint. Let's just say I work at Nick Scott Enterprises as a chef, because I'm a chef. Let's say Nick Scott fires me, which he won't, because I know he won't, because he's an ally of our community. But there is no teeth, no power, nothing behind the Human Rights Commission for the LGBT community and across the Commonwealth. There's no teeth, and we need to pass the Pennsylvania Fairness Act, and I need your guys' help. This is a moment in time, not just for the LGBT community, but Councilman Horton has stood up for the African American community for quite some time. And Erie has been labeled worst city for the African American community. And for the past so many years, you can see my record, I've stood up for the LGBT community. Where's Rich McCarthy, Will Kohler, and Mike Mulliner? Yes, we are presenting Erie as an LGBT-friendly city. But look at that equality index I've mailed you. Don't lie to me ever again. Let's take the rose-colored glasses off, because Erie is not an LGBT-friendly place to live. Our laws don't justify what our rhetoric has been about. I mean, I've been trying to work with the LGBT organizations in Erie for quite some time. but because the infighting and the exclusion and the twistedness and the BS that they painted me as a drug addict whenever I had to serve probation. I served my time twice. I served my time to the community. I did my time. I'm going to be released from Stairways to Drug and Alcohol as to being discharged, meaning that if I had a problem, I wanted to be transparent. I wanted to show the community that if I had a problem, I went and I got taken care of. Now we're going to go into the next problem. On a website called Adam for Adam, there is 491 profiles from Erie Metropolitan that are gay men, and 91 of them engage in narcotic activity. That is 25% almost. And so I would like to step up and I'd like to work with Kathy Dahlkemper and the council to help curb the opiate epidemic, not just in the LGBT community, minority community, but in the community itself. Because Nicole Salone, Judge Mead, Dr. Rush, all said I am not a crazy person. All said that I am not the problem. Because there was 302s done on me in August of 2016, 3 times, because Mike Brawley is the problem. I sent Erie County Council Executive Kathy Dahlkemper at least 100 pictures, safe chats, documents about the problem in Erie. He's part of this dark net subculture underground that all it is just gay men smoking crystal meth and sitting there and just engaging in illegal activities. So I've been calling Crisis Services and the
Mr.
Department of
Brendel,
Human
thank you.
Services.
Mr. Brendel, your time has expired. Thank you.
Hold on, wait,
No, your
okay.
time has expired. Thank you very much. You're
Yeah.
welcome back at another time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else from the public wish to be heard tonight? Nobody? Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Leon,
I'd like to move to approve the minutes from November 14th to January 9th.
Second.
moved by Mr. Leon and seconded by Mr. Horton. Are there any changes to those meeting minutes? As always, because this is the longest one, we appreciate those that have to transcribe it, most especially. Mr. Smith, roll call, please.
On the minutes, Mr. Anderson,
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika,
Yes.
Mr. Horton,
Yes.
Mr. Leon,
Yes,
Mrs. Law,
Yes.
Mr. Rastetter,
Yes.
Chairman Faust.
Yes. Reports of county officials, county executive, and/or her designee.
None tonight, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Sparber. Finance Committee, Mrs. Fatika.
Yes, the Finance Committee met on Thursday, January 18th, and agreed to put under old business items A, B, and C. Under new business, ordinance items A through H. And in addition, items I through Y.
Thank you, Mrs. Fatika. Any questions for Mrs. Fatika? There was no Personnel Committee since there was no agenda items last Thursday, so reports of other members of council, there was not any in caucus. Has anybody changed their mind? Okay, moving on to old business. Second reading of ordinance number 1, please, Mr. Smith, and title only.
A second reading of ordinance number 1, 2018, amending Erie County Industrial Development Authority, Article 2, Section 5D1CII of the Administrative Code of Erie County.
so moved.
Second.
Moved by Mr. Leon and seconded by Mrs. Lull. Is there any discussion? I will only repeat what I said before, meaning no disrespect to anybody who may support this particular ordinance, but I think this is just an example of politics at its worst. I think this is reminiscent of the court packing schemes of old, of the ECRA board packing scheme of recent time. I think it's odd that council has to make this request on behalf of the administration twice. That's a red flag to me. And the fact that I know this was addressed last meeting, but the fact that this occurred after the election and in the same timetable, the things that went on with ECRA, it just causes me a lot of pause. It causes me a lot of concern for the future, and for that, I will be voting no. Mr. Smith, roll call, please.
On ordinance number 1, Mrs. Fatika,
Yes.
Mr. Horton,
No.
Mr. Leone,
Yes.
Mrs. Law,
Yes.
Mr. Rastetter,
Yes.
Mr. Anderson,
Yes.
Chairman Faust,
No. Okay, next is a second reading of ordinance number 2, please, in title only.
A second reading of ordinance number 2, 2018 gaming fund budget, revised revenue and expenditures of $719,806 from release of restricted GCAC grant.
So moved.
Second.
Moved by Mr. Anderson and second by Mrs. Lowell. Any discussion? I will only say this before we get to Mr. Horton's motion, is that I'm prepared to go forward with these. If any of this is moved to be tabled, I will support that. As I said in the back, when I requested more information, I was given time to get it, and so if other members of council would like that opportunity, I think that should be granted, because I don't think GCAC's back is necessarily up against the wall just yet. If I really truly felt it was, I would be of another mind. But I think just look at some of these things, and this is no disrespect to Mr. Jones, who is here tonight, or GCAC in general, because this is an agency that matters a lot to this community. And I am not interested in defaming them or causing them any undue angst whatsoever. But I will just ask my members of council, like I did last week with some other things. If these letters were not GCAC, but if they were ECRA, and we read some of the things that we've seen here, and they're nothing illegal, I want you to be aware of that for sure. It's just money was spent in ways that we wouldn't normally want. And again, that's not illegal, it's not even unethical. It's just there are things that have gone on that we probably would have wished that would have happened otherwise, and we can work with GCAC to straighten those things out in the future. But would you feel the same way? I'm not sure if that would be the case, but I've spoken my piece. Mr. Horton, go ahead, before we get to his tabling motion.
All right. The finger pointing and innuendos, as well as the outright accusations, have placed GCAC, its employees, and those getting services at risk. I am at a loss to explain the motivations of an outgoing councilman. And one has to wonder if there was some sort of personal agenda that GCAC was singled out from other organizations requesting funds. As elected officials, we have a responsibility to improve the lives of our constituents. Delaying funds to GCAC and its clients will not improve lives and may cause great harm. I intend to vote to move the funds to GCAC. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Leon?
I believe that Mr. Horton indicated he wanted separation. Are you still?
I just wanted everybody to state their piece before we got that, that's all. If you had something to say, that's all.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, I intend to,
I'm sorry,
ahead.
did you?
Yeah, I'm
Okay,
done.
you just want to make sure we didn't forget. Okay, go ahead, Mr. Leon. Harden.
out of respect to all my colleagues, and everyone here in the gallery, I too echo the fine work that JCAT and the employees over there do. And I've stated time and time again my opinion of the CEO, Mr. Jones. I believe that his reputation and his integrity are above reproach. And I'm looking for every way to resolve this in a way that's favorable to JCAC. Tonight, I'll be asking that we separate the area agency on aging money simply because I don't have information. I've submitted a letter to the solicitor and to the accountant, and I came here last Thursday after being away for a while, and I informed all of you that the only information I had, in fact, was the stuff that our former colleague dropped, supported by a bunch of documentation. I told you that I had had some preliminary conversations with Mr. Jones, but nothing further. I told you that I hadn't heard anything from the county executive, the solicitor at that point, the accountant, nor from the committee that had met with the county executive, Mr. Jones. That committee comprised of Councilman Leon, Councilman Brennan, and I guess the county executive, and I didn't have any feedback from any of that stuff. And then since Thursday, as I acquire more information, I see that the tax assessment office has entered into the fray. So it's my intent, my mother, who wasn't a very educated person, but she was wise indeed, she said, when you see people that you love and there's a difference of opinion, you stay neutral. And if someone comes to you and you're unable to stay neutral, you look for compromise. So I've sought compromise, and I approached my colleagues about just releasing the money from 2017 that JCAC is entitled to, that they haven't received because of the budget impasse last year. I also asked that, was willing to release the area agency on aging money, but all the things that, the practices that were in the past, I do have some questions. And the community has questions. And so tonight, I'm prepared to vote in the affirmative to release the area agency on aging monies, but I would request that the administrative portion on that, for the reasons that Dr. Faust stated, that JCAC's back is not against the wall, and more needs to be determined as to what GDIC is and the relationship is. And I think that, I don't think it's unreasonable to be allotted a little bit more time just to examine that. The one thing that I do want to say is on behalf of myself, we certainly as a body should have done or could have done things a lot better. I hate that this played out or is playing out in the public domain. I also own, you have to own what's yours, and you have to move on. And so we own it. We haven't done things in a way. We had a similar situation last year with EMTA, and we had to reevaluate some relationships in the way that we do business. And so it's my hopes that if we when we separate them, that of course the agency money would be approved. It's my hopes that the 2017 money, that the administration would be able to expedite that in some way, if at all possible. And it's my hopes that we would table the additional administrative money so that we could at least have another week or two that I can have some time to digest all of this stuff.
Before you make that official request, because once you move the table, it's a non-discussionable item, I failed to mention that I did ask for information from GCAC and Mr. Jones directly. We did get that recently, and I just want you, I appreciate the detail that was provided in that. Because that's information that and I'm working with Joe and Doug to come up with an ordinance, so we have that type of information ahead of time. And the fact that we didn't have it ahead of time is not GCAC's fault. We didn't ask for it till now. I want to make that clear. But that's something that I will be presenting to council here soon enough. So we have that information ahead of time at the budget time, and that at the end of the year, we can do some sort of closeout report so the agency or organization can tell us how that money was spent, successfully or not. And just because they didn't achieve their goals doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing or that they've been ineligible for funding in the future. So with that, you've asked for separation. How about we
Mr.
take
Chairman,
care of? Yes, Mr. Anderson.
I'd like to make some comments. I want to, again, echo the comments that I've continuously made, that I think it's a concerning practice if we pick out one grant recipient and ask them to have funds restricted or come in and change the way in which we ask them to receive restricted or unrestricted funds, and we don't do that fairly across the board. I think it's our issue. As Mr. Horton said, we need to own it. It's a county issue. It's an administrative issue. It's not a grant recipient issue. So we need to own it and make sure that we are fair across the board with all the grant recipients to make sure we have a form in which we state where we feel
restrictions or unacceptable budget items are being presented to us, and then we need to have a closeout form at the end of the year to make sure each and every one of those organizations has followed through with that. I think that is a process perhaps that's long overdue in the county, and if that's a positive outcome of this situation, then I think the county is better for it. But I have real concern of us potentially hurting the end user. There are senior citizens out there in our community who are counting on the services of GCAC. I want to make sure that all of those end users, that their services are not interrupted. And I want to make sure that we're not picking out any one particular organization for any specific political reason or somebody's political agenda to hold up funding for them when in fact I think we should thank both Danny Jones and the entire GCAC staff for their forthrightness in getting us information, the detailed amount, their patience with us, their willingness to continuously answer the same questions that they've answered on numerous other occasions. It concerns me that we say there's still questions out there when the answers have already been given to us. So with that being said, I intend to vote to release the funds to GCAC. And then we have an opportunity to, behind the scenes with the administration, to sit down with, not only with GCAC, but with all the other grant recipients and put together a fair and impartial across-the-board for next year, for us to be able to make sure that what we're doing is fair. So, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson. I don't disagree with a lot of what you said, but as I said in finance on Thursday, anytime that council has questions about a particular grant, as the fiduciary agents of this county, it is incumbent upon us to investigate that as best we can to get answers to that, and Mr. Jones has done that, certainly to my satisfaction. The reason I will vote for the tabling measure is that if, even though my questions have been answered, if another member of council has questions that they don't feel have been fully addressed, until it's, a point where we're really, our backs are against the wall, where services may be crippled, I'm willing to give them a little bit more time. But with that, if we could, your request was to separate them. Can we take care of the AAA first? Because I think that's in the, everybody's in the affirmative on that. So Mr. Smith, Mr. Talarico.
Excuse me, but just for clarification, I mean, he has the right to separate, without a vote. But do I understand that he wants to separate the AAA budget from the general budget?
The release of just those funds at this time is what he's requesting.
I heard him say that he wanted to table it.
Table the other half,
Table it.
the release of those other half of funds, the more administrative matters. Mr. Smith, roll call, please, on the AAA funds.
Mr. Horton,
Yes.
Mr. Leone,
Yes.
Mrs. Law,
Yes.
Mr. Rastatter,
Yes.
Mr. Anderson,
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika,
Yes.
Chairman Faust,
Yes. Go ahead and make your request.
I move to table the administrative portion of that disbursement.
Moved by Mr. Leone, or I'm sorry, Mr. Horton. Is there a second?
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Leone?
I'll second it for the sake of putting it on the table regardless, but I'm going to vote against that.
Okay, move, and this is a motion, there's just no discussion, so it's been moved and seconded. Roll call, please, on tabling the administrative portion of the funds of GCAC. Mr. Smith, roll call, please.
Mr. Leone,
No.
Mrs. Law,
No.
Mr. Rastatter,
No.
Mr. Anderson,
No.
Mrs. Fatika,
No.
Mr. Horton,
Yes.
Chairman Faust,
Yes. Okay, so that motion fails, so is there any further discussion on the administrative side of releasing these funds for GCAC? Roll call, please, Mr. Smith, on those funds.
Mrs. Law,
Yes.
Mr. Rastatter,
Yes.
Mr. Anderson,
Mr. Chairman, can I just ask for clarification? So we're now voting to release the remaining portion of the funds, is that correct? Yes.
Mrs. Fatika?
Yes.
Mr. Horton?
Yes.
Mr. Leon?
Yes.
Chairman Faust?
Yes. So both those set of funds are passed. Moving on to a second reading of ordinance number 3, please, in title only.
A second reading of ordinance number 3, 2018, an ordinance to create the Erie County Land Bank.
I'd make
Second.
seconded.
Moved by Mr. Leon and seconded by Mrs. Fatika. Is there any discussion? I will just say that I will be voting no against this measure. I think that's relatively clear to most people why. As I've said before, I don't think, in regard to this issue, the most creative answer this community can find is to make it really a department of county government. Our new, at least our interim head of planning here is Amy Murdoch, who I have the highest respect for. If I had my way about 4 years ago, she'd be working for council, but she's not, so I wish her well. I know she'll do well in planning. And I'm not going to cheer against the land bank's success. This is an important feature that hopefully will help our community in a lot of positive ways. I just don't think this is the best way to go about it. It's going to expand the employees of county government sooner or later, probably sooner rather than later. And I think this issue could have been addressed maybe a little bit more creatively otherwise. So even though I'll be voting no, I'll be looking to support as best I can going forward. Mr. Smith, roll call, please.
On ordinance 3, Mr. Rastetter?
Yes.
Mr. Anderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika?
Yes.
Mr. Horton?
No.
Mr. Leon?
Yes.
Mrs. Law?
Yes.
Chairman Faust?
No. Do we have a motion to
Mr.
approve tonight's
Chairman.
agenda? Mr. Leon.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to move to make second readings for items A, B, C, D, E, and G.
Moved by
Second.
Mr. Leon and seconded by Mrs. Fatika to amend tonight's agenda to make second readings of those ordinances. Any discussion? Mr. Smith, roll call.
Mr. Anderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika?
Yes.
Mr. Horton?
Yes.
Mr. Leon?
Yes.
Mrs. Law?
Yes.
Mr. Rastetter?
Yes.
Chairman Faust?
Yes. For those of you that may be new, by the way, I apologize. Anything that is an ordinance needs 2 readings, and oftentimes, just for issues of timeliness, we'll waive that requirement to be able to take advantage of whatever action is presented in the ordinance. So that's what we've done with those 5 or 6 tonight. And then you will see an overview on the screen of what we are voting on as you follow along. So with that, Mr. Smith, a second reading of ordinance number 4, please, in title only. Don't sign that.
A second reading of ordinance number 4, 2018, first 2018 Public Health Fund budget, supplemental appropriation of $1,000 to correct action sheet number 4.
So moved.
Second.
Moved by Mr. Leon and seconded by Mrs. Law. Is there any discussion? Mr. Smith, roll call, please.
On ordinance number 4, Mrs. Fatika?
Yes.
Mr. Horton?
Yes.
Mr. Leon?
Yes.
Mrs. Law?
Yes.
Mr. Rastetter?
Yes.
Mr. Anderson?
Yes.
Chairman Faust?
Yes. Second reading of ordinance number 5, please, in title only, Mr. Smith.
A second reading of ordinance number 5, 2018, second 2018 general fund budget, supplemental appropriation of $1,000 for correction of budget action sheet number 32.
So moved.
Second.
Moved by Mr. Leon and seconded by Mrs. Law. Is there any discussion? Mr. Smith, roll call, please.
On ordinance number 5, Mr. Horton?
Yes.
Mr. Leon?
Yes.
Mrs. Law?
Yes.
Mr. Rastetter?
Yes.
Mr. Anderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika?
Yes.
Chairman Faust?
Yes. Second reading of ordinance number 6, please, in title only.
A second reading of ordinance number 6, 2018, third 2018 general fund budget, supplemental appropriation of $24,000 in creation of professional fees line item for unspent 2017 up for the job funds.
So move.
Second. Moved by Mr. Horton and seconded by Mr. Leon. Is there any discussion? Roll call, please, Mr. Smith.
On ordinance 6, Mr. Leon,
Yes.
Mrs. Law,
Yes.
Mr. Rastetter,
Yes.
Mr. Anderson,
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika,
Yes.
Mr. Horton,
Yes.
Chairman Faust,
Yes. Second reading of ordinance number 7, please, in title only.
a second reading of ordinance number 7, 2018, first 2018 Employees Fringe Benefit Fund budget, supplemental appropriation of $4,000, and creation of line items for new county wellness bureau.
So moved.
Second.
Moved by Mrs. Law and seconded by Mr. Leon. Is there any discussion? Mr. Smith, roll call, please.
On ordinance 7, Mrs. Law,
Yes.
Mr. Rastetter,
Yes.
Mr. Anderson,
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika,
Yes.
Mr. Horton,
Yes.
Mr. Leon,
Yes.
Chairman Faust,
Yes. Second reading of ordinance number 8, please, in title only.
a second reading of ordinance number 8, 2018, second 2018 Public Health Fund budget, supplemental appropriation of $13,334 for Blue Zones Community Health Assessment.
So
I'd
moved.
make a motion. Okay.
I'll second.
You guys want to argue about it anymore? Okay. Moved by Mr. Anderson and seconded by Mr. Leon. Is there any discussion? Mr. Smith, roll call, please.
On ordinance number 8, Mr. Rastetter,
Yes.
Mr. Anderson,
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika,
Yes.
Mr. Horton,
Yes.
Mr. Leon,
Your vote, Mr.
Oh, yes.
Mrs. Law,
Yes.
Chairman Faust,
Yes. First reading of ordinance number 9, please, in title only.
a first reading of ordinance number 9, 2018, fourth 2018 general fund budget, supplemental appropriation of $15,500 for review of counties' deferred compensation plans.
Second reading of ordinance number 10, please, in title only.
The second reading of ordinance number 10, 2018 Children and Youth Services Fund budget, revised expenditures and creation of expense line for court-ordered placement.
So moved.
Second.
Moved by Mr. Leon and seconded by Mrs. Lull. Is there any discussion? From time to time, we have new placements for youth coming out of Erie County, and this is an example of that. Mr. Smith, roll call, please.
On ordinance 10, Mr. Anderson,
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika,
Yes.
Mr. Horton,
Yes.
Mr. Leon,
Yes.
Mrs. Law,
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Mr. Rastetter,
Yes.
Chairman Faust,
Yes.
You still have first
We got
reading.
one more, right? First reading of ordinance number 11, please, in title only.
a first reading of ordinance number 11, 2018, fifth 2018 general fund budget, supplemental appropriation of $38,000 for increase in professional fees.
You will see we're going to possibly move this to a second, but since we want to tighten up the language in the contract to be able to move these both at the same time, we're going to allow this to proceed with
Mr.
regular
Chairman,
order. Mr. Leon.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to take items I through R, which are leases, as one vote.
Moved by Mr. Leon,
Second.
seconded by Mr. Horton. Is there any discussion? These are all MDJ leases, so which is why we're doing that, to release any objection. I will just state that I understand when we have concerns about leases and things like that, and I think these definitely going forward, we need to take a look at them. As I mentioned in finance last week, there was a plan presented to the county from the redevelopment authority to try to address that in the long term, and it was declined. And all we did by waiting some 2 or 3 months on these particular leases was increase the price to the county. It was minimal, but nevertheless, it was increased, and we just need to be careful of that going forward. Roll call, please. On all of these resolutions, please, Mr. Smith.
Mrs. Fatika?
Yes.
Mr. Horton?
Yes.
Mr. Leone?
Yes.
Mrs. Law?
Yes.
Mr. Rastetter?
Yes.
Mr. Anderson?
Yes.
Chairman Faust?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Leone,
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to move the table of resolution number 12.
in your motion, could you include resolution number 14, Mr.
That's
Leone?
fine, I'll include resolution 14.
I'll second that.
Moved by Mr. Leone and seconded by Mrs. Lull. There's no discussion on a tabling motion, so we'll move to the roll call, please, Mr. Smith. Move the table. Motion to table.
Mr. Horton?
Yes.
Mr. Leone?
Yes.
Mrs. Law?
Yes.
Mr. Rastetter?
Yes.
Mr. Anderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika?
Yes.
Chairman Faust?
Yes. Okay, possible adoption of resolution number 13, please, in title only.
Resolution number 13, 2018, resolution to approve real estate tax agreement between the Erie County Board of Assessment Appeals, the School District of the City of Erie, the City of Erie, and UPMC Hammett.
So moved.
Second.
Moved by Mrs. Lull and seconded by Mr. Leone. Is there any discussion? Roll call, please, Mr. Smith.
On Resolution 13, Mr. Leone?
Yes.
Mrs. Law?
Yes.
Mr. Rastetter?
Yes.
Mr. Anderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika?
Yes.
Mr. Horton?
Yes.
Chairman Faust?
Yes. Possible adoption of resolution number 15, please, in title only.
Resolution number 15, 2018, approving solicitor contracts submitted by the Office of Sheriff.
So moved.
Second.
Moved by Mrs. Lull and seconded by Mr. Leone. Is there any discussion? Mr. Smith, roll call, please.
Mrs. Law?
Yes.
Mr. Rastetter?
Yes.
Mr. Anderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika?
Yes.
Mr. Horton?
Yes.
Mr. Leone?
Yes.
Chairman Faust?
Yes. Do I have a motion to approve the appointment of Morgan Nicole Palumbi to the Erie County Library Board?
I'd like to make the motion.
Moved by Mr. Anderson. Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Mr. Leone. Is there any discussion regarding that appointment?
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Anderson.
I would just like to say that this is a very gratifying appointment for me. Morgan Palombi, Ms. Palombi, is a graduate of Mercyhurst Prep and Kent State University, and has just recently received a master's degree from Edinburgh. She is a teacher at the Charter School of Excellence, very interested and committed to our community, and interested in watching our community and participating in our community moving forward. And I think she will be a very energetic and engaged member to the Library Advisory Board, bringing a new approach to the library and how the new generation of users use the library, particularly with the new Idea Labs and all of the exciting things that the library has been partaking in. And so I'm very gratified to put Morgan's name forward and ask my colleagues to approve her name. Thank you.
Any further discussion? On the appointment, roll call, please, Mr. Smith.
Mr. Rastetter?
Yes.
Mr. Anderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika?
Yes.
Mr. Horton?
Yes.
Mr. Leone?
Yes.
Mrs. Law?
Yes.
Chairman Faust?
Yes. Do I have a motion to approve the appointment of Tim McCormick to the Erie County Redevelopment Authority?
Also move.
Moved by
Second.
Mr. Leone and seconded by Mrs. Lull. Is there any discussion regarding that appointment? Mr. Smith, roll call, please.
Mr. Anderson,
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika,
Yes.
Mr. Horton,
Yes.
Mr. Leone,
Yes.
Mrs. Law,
Yes.
Mr. Rastetter,
Yes.
Chairman Faust,
Yes,
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Leone.
move for the sale of parcel from the repository with the listing of the index numbers that are at present.
Second.
Moved by Mr. Leone and seconded by Mr. Horton. Is there any discussion regarding those sale? That sale, I should say. Roll call, please, Mr. Smith.
Mrs. Fatika,
Yes.
Mr. Horton,
Yes.
Mr. Leone,
Yes.
Mrs. Law,
Yes.
Mr. Rastetter,
Yes.
Mr. Anderson,
Yes.
Chairman Faust.
Yes, before we adjourn, I just want to let members of council know that I worked with Ms. Brader to finalize the liaison list today. That will be distributed to you shortly. I did my best to accommodate everybody's requests and not to move anybody around if they wish to not be moved around, so hopefully that will meet your satisfaction.
Move to adjourn.
Council stands adjourned.